Good afternoon, dignitaries, professors, students, fellow colleagues, those of you who have competed and shared such insightful, sorry, can you hear me now? Let's start again. Good afternoon, dignitaries, professors, fellow students, colleagues, those of you who have shared with us your findings, your work, and they've all been very interesting. Our topic is tracing the source of greenhouse gas emissions globally and in our backyard. Have you ever driven a car? Maybe a commercial vehicle? Have you ever used coal for heating or maybe cooking? Have you ever been involved in mining? Maybe bauxite, uranium, coal, or any other? Today, our world is faced with many challenges, one of which is global warming or climate change. The question is, how are you and I contributing to climate change or global warming? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a United Nations panel designed to assess the science of climate change, indicated in its October 2018 report that human-induced warming has increased by 1.2 degrees against the industry standard set in 2017. That report also indicated that the world is warming by 1.2 degrees, and it's set to continue along that trend to 3 or 4 degrees. If it continues in that trend, ask yourself, what do you think will happen to planet Earth? My colleague, Asiedu, who is sitting in front here, and when question time comes, he will answer all of the questions. David Silberman, who couldn't be here with us today because of work commitments, and I, Ellen Tappin, coached by Dr. Steve Knode and Yelena Betensky, of the University of Maryland University College, go Terps, would like to invite you to share with us on tracing the source of greenhouse gas emissions globally and in our backyard. To frame our topic, we looked at several guided questions. What are greenhouse gases and how does carbon dioxide play a role? Which countries are top producers of greenhouse gases and CO2? How do these compare on a per capita basis? Are emissions concentrated in certain US states? Which sectors and industries contribute to CO2 emissions in the United States? And are there health concerns? Greenhouse gases, as many of us know, and I'm sure we heard quite a lot about greenhouse gases in the previous presentations, are trapped in the atmosphere. And one of them that we will focus on is carbon dioxide. As many of us know, carbon dioxide is also removed by plants through a carbon cycle process. We looked at several data sets, and we chose the 3 that you see on the screen because they contained what we felt were enough statistics by year, by sector, by country, by age, by death rate to help us form our analysis. And we used IBM Watson Analytics to help in our analysis and build our model, as well as Tableau for visualization. I indicated in my introduction that the world is warming. And so what we wanted to look at was the average land temperature over a period of time. And if you look on the chart on your screen, you will see on the left, going to the right, that the average land temperature has been increasing considerably, specifically in the years 2005, 2007, 2010. It reached its highest peak, reaching almost 10 degrees Celsius in the year 2016, based on the data sets that we had collected and used in our analysis. Next, we looked at the CO2 mean emissions. And if you look on the chart on your screen, you will see again, for the data collected from 1958, we see a considerable increase. So there's an upward trend of CO2 emissions. We wanted to look at countries across the world because as we talked about increasing in land temperature, it was not unique to the United States. So we wanted to do some comparison and look at industrialized versus not industrialized. So we looked at some of the industrialized countries, we looked at G8 countries, and we added a few African countries to get a real sense and to do some comparison in terms of how are industrialized comparing with non-industrialized. Now, one of the things we wanted to point out is that the Kyoto Protocol, and I may not have said that correctly, but that protocol was established to help countries, I think it was established in 1992, to set a stage for countries to provide their data so we can look at across the globe how countries are doing. And if you look in the far top left, you will see that green graph coming downwards actually is the United States. So the United States has been contributing about 50% of the world's greenhouse gases. Fortunately, the United States show a decline as it continued trending downward. But not only is the United States, if you will, an outlier, but it's also another outlier in the bright green graph coming downward, where by 2005, the United States and China were actually producing the same amount of greenhouse gases. And actually, in this particular graph, what we did was focus in on carbon dioxide. And one of the reasons we focused on only carbon dioxide was because in 2016, carbon dioxide was 81% of all greenhouse gases. So we wanted to zoom into that to see, well, what really was causing the world to warm or the earth land temperature to increase. In 2005 and onward, China surpassed the United States, becoming the top producer of CO2 emissions. And I also want to point to, if you can see further on the bottom left, is about 1969 or 70, when China actually started providing data on its CO2 emissions. Prior to that time, it was not. Next, we looked at the annual percent share of carbon dioxide emission, and we compared 2000 and 2016 because we wanted to look and see how were things happening, how was it trending. And so the solid blue indicates the higher annual percent share of carbon dioxide. And what we noted was the United States in 2000 was the top producer of carbon dioxide. And you had China and Russia producing, but not as much as the United States. But in 2016, what we noted was that China became the top producer of CO2 emission, or its annual percentage share. So we said, well, let's do some more, a deep dive, and see what other statistics or whatever analysis can tell us in terms of who really is producing carbon dioxide and how is this greenhouse gases impacting the earth and our own existence. And so what we looked at was the per capita emission of carbon dioxide in 2016. And in this graph, if you look again using the darker blue to tell where there's a higher level of CO2 emission, you would see where the United States and Canada are the top producers of CO2, followed by Russia. And then we look at the per capita CO2 emissions and total population, and what we observe in these bubbles, again to the top left, there were two outliers, where India and China are the top, have the smaller bubble with a larger population, but they have the lowest per capita CO2 emissions, compared to the United States to your far right with a larger bubble. And then CO2 emission by US states, what we discovered was Texas was the top producer. And then we looked at the sectors, and we looked at 5 sectors, transportation in the purple, electric power in the orange, yellow was the industrial sector, residential green, and commercial blue. And what we discovered was, looking at industries, we did a word cloud, and we saw where power plants dominated in this particular industry of CO2 emissions. Then we looked at several facilities, and we found that for facilities producing more than 2 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions annually, we found that Martin Lake and W.A. Parish were the top producers. And then we had Wyoming was one of those that were producing top in energy-related CO2 emissions. And CO2 emissions by transportation, we had Texas and California were top producers. Again, Texas is ranked in the top states of producing most of the carbon dioxide, even though in the commercial sector, it was California versus Texas, New York and California versus Texas. And then when we looked at the industrial activities by state, again, Texas, Louisiana, California, and Pennsylvania were the top producers, but we looked at Louisiana being offshore oil-shore hosting. And then we looked at age-adjusted death rate versus CO2 emissions. And here what we recognized was there was no very correlation between the two. But then we went and looked at the 10-year average CO2 by death, and we saw that there was some correlation between the death rate and the 10-year average. So the drivers of average death, we use IBM Analytics, and we saw that some of the key drivers based on IBM Analytics providing this to us was electric power and commercial. And so we saw that based on the sector and the information that we had found, this was actually accurate. And then the 10-year average CO2 and residential were some of the high predictors. In summary, CO2 is the largest greenhouse gas emitted. China surpassed the United States in 2005 as the largest producer of CO2. However, China's per capita CO2 emissions are much lower than the USA and Canada. Looking at largest contributors of USA emissions, electricity generation is the highest, followed by transportation. Texas is the largest contribution of CO2 emissions. However, it has a larger population and a larger area compared to most states. The data suggests that higher emissions are correlated with higher deaths. Closing remarks, we have listened to several great topics today. Yesterday, they all talked about data, advocacy, awareness, tools, technology that we can use to improve the data collection and how we share that data. But one of the challenges we face is if we continue increasing the land temperature at the rate we are going, then there will be no need for any technology because we all will become extinct. Thank you.
Questions from the floor?
If you have to, just questions.
Sure, go on.
Again, Bajwa from UMUC. You said the electricity production was correlated with the carbon dioxide. Are those electricity plants coal-fired in Texas?
Not all of them are coal-fired. But we think that the systems that are used to generate the electricity are the systems that contribute most to the CO2 emission. And so if the particular electricity is not a system that generates CO2, then that was not a consideration in our analysis.
No, they are not hydroelectric. The only carbon dioxide generating fuel is the coal, maybe followed by diesel to some extent.
We didn't look at
Okay,
hydroelectric sources.
thank you.
Maybe we'll just say everybody's tired, huh?
Do you guys come up with any actionable recommendations of what we should do to decrease global warming?
Yes, one of the things that I noticed is that the issue of CO2 generation is not a wholesale issue. For example, we realize that in Texas, electric power is the main cause. But when you go to a place like New York, it is transportation. And so if we want to have, to fight CO2 emission, we have to get targeted programs. And so the program that is designed for a place like New York is going to be different from a program designed for a place like Texas. Want to add something?
Any other questions? All right, thank you guys. Good job.
Thank you.